run this computer and share my full screen. Okay, here we are. So in this video, we're going to cover chapter 3. This is going to be welfare. We're going to cover the whole chapter. Today, I'm going to break up the video into 2 parts for your sake and mine. And then tomorrow, we're going to be covering chapter 4. I know I've been kind of sprinting through material. This is because most of it's been review so far. Chapter 4 will not be review, so we're going to take it much slower there so that we make sure we're all in a good place with this stuff. Okay, so let's get started. So welfare, when I say welfare, I'm not talking about the government handouts. I'm talking about the measure of total benefits received by consumers and producers in a market. So consumer surplus is what we call the benefits to buyers, and producer surplus is the benefits to the sellers. Okay, so let's start with consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is just the difference between what consumers are willing to pay for a good, in other words, their demand for the good, and what the consumers actually pay for the good, which is the price of the good. And so let's do a little example to illustrate this concept. So we've got 3 people, Josh, Stephen, and Anna, and they're all willing to pay some amount for a textbook, and their amounts differ for each of them. Now the textbook is, the market price for this textbook is $40, and so that's what they'll each have to pay. So to find the consumer surplus for Josh, I need to take what he's willing to pay, which is $100, and subtract that from what he has to pay, which is 40. And so if I do that subtraction, I get 60. And so that's the consumer surplus for Josh. Now I should do this again for Stephen and Anna to get the total consumer surplus in the market. So Stephen was willing to pay up to $80. He only had to pay 40. So his individual consumer surplus was $40. And finally, Anna was willing to pay 70. She only had to pay 40 again. And so she gets $30 of consumer surplus. We can add all these consumer surpluses up to get a total consumer surplus here. And so that's just going to come out to 130. And that's our consumer surplus for this little market for this textbook. Okay, so now we should think about consumer surplus in a more broad sense, in a total market sense. And so the first thing we should do is think about what the demand curve is actually telling us. So at a given price, so let's just say this price right here, price A, the demand curve is telling us our quantity demanded at that price, right? So at a price of A, we demand QA goods, right? So we're willing to buy QA at a price of A. That's what the market is willing to do, right? So that's the willingness to pay for QA amount of this good. And so since the demand curve is telling us what consumers are willing to pay for a good, and we know consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and the price they actually have to pay, in aggregate, consumer surplus is just going to be the difference between the demand curve and the price, right? And so that area is going to give us this shaded triangle here, and that's going to be our consumer surplus. Now, producer surplus is fairly similar to consumer surplus. And now when we're talking about producer surplus, we're talking about the difference between what sellers are willing to sell and the price they receive, right? So the price they receive should be greater than the price they're willing to sell if they're going to sell. So let's again take a simple example to illustrate the point. And so again, we have these 3 students. Now they're potentially selling tutoring services, and we have a market price for tutoring services, right? So if they decide to sell their services, they will receive $20, right? And each one of them is willing to sell at a different price. And so the difference between what they would get and what they were willing to sell for Josh is $20, the price of the market price for tutoring. What he was willing to sell at is 10. So his individual producer surplus is 10. And this at the top shouldn't say consumer surplus again, it should say producer. Sorry about that. All right, so Stephen was willing to sell his services for $12. Again, he gets 20, so the difference between that is 8, and Anna was willing to sell for 15, so her individual producer surplus was 5. We can add up these values, and this should give us 23, if I've done my arithmetic correctly. And so our producer surplus in this market is 23. Okay, so now again, we're going to take it to a broader thought process here. And so we should think about what the supply curve is telling us. And so the supply curve tells us at a given price, so let's again call it price A, that's telling us what quantity we're willing to supply at that price. So at the price of A, we're willing to supply QA amount of whatever good this market is for, right? And so since the supply curve is telling us what producers are willing to sell, we can calculate producer surplus for this market by taking the difference between the price and the supply curve, which is telling us what suppliers are willing to sell at. Right, so again, we're going to get this nice triangular region. That's our producer surplus. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is just put these two concepts together and take a market. So we have a demand curve and a supply curve, and calculate our total surplus, right? So the first thing we're going to do is find our equilibrium points, our equilibrium point, price and quantity, plot those on a graph where we've graphed our demand and supply curve. Then we can identify our producer surplus and consumer surplus on the graph, and then we can calculate producer and consumer surplus. Okay, so I'd encourage you to go through this exercise on your own. So maybe if you want to pause the video, work through it yourself first. Otherwise, you don't have to do that. You can just work along with me. Okay, so let's first find our equilibrium price and quantity. To do that, I'm going to set these two prices equal. So in other words, just setting these two things equal. So 150 minus 6Q is equal to 50 plus 2Q. So we can subtract 50 on both sides and add 6Q on both sides. And that will give us 100 on the left and 8Q on the right. If we divide by 8 on both sides, that'll give us a quantity equal to 12.5. Pause real fast. Okay, so now that we have our quantity, our Q star, this is going to be our equilibrium quantity. We can take this quantity, plug it into either the supply or demand equation to get our equilibrium price. So P star is going to be equal to 50 plus 2 times Q star, which is 12.5. So 50 plus 2 times 12.5 is going to be 50 plus 25, or 75. Okay, so now we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. So in the next slide, I'm going to graph all that out with the supply and demand curve as well. Okay, so here it is. You've got basically your final answers on the slide here. But we've graphed our demand curve here and our supply curve. Of course, we have our equilibrium point. The price is 75 and our equilibrium quantity is 12.5. And what we want to know is, what is this area, our consumer surplus, and what is this area, our producer surplus? And of course, we know this top triangle is consumer surplus because it's the area between the demand curve and the price. And we know this area is producer surplus because it's the area between the price and the supply curve. So let's calculate this consumer surplus first. So the area of a triangle is 1/2 times base times height, in case you've forgotten from high school. So we're going to have 1/2 times the base, which is just going to be this 12.5. So the base will go out until equilibrium. So that's 12.5 times the height. And the height is just going to be the difference between this the y-intercept of the demand curve and the equilibrium price, which is 75. So we're going to have 1/2 times 12.5 times 150 minus 75. And so that's just going to give us a total consumer surplus of 468.75. Now we can do basically the same thing with producer surplus. Again, we're going to have 1/2 times the base. And the base is not going to change. It's going to be this 12.5 again. And then the height is going to be the equilibrium price minus the y-intercept of the supply curve, which is 50. And so we have 1/2 times 12.5 times 25, and that's going to give us 156.25. And then if we wanted to find total surplus, we're just going to add our consumer surplus to our producer surplus, and that will give us 625. And then one thing you can do to check this, if you wanted to, is calculate just the area of the larger triangle instead of doing it individually with consumer surplus and producer surplus. And you would again find that the whole area is 625 by multiplying 12.5 times 1/2 times 150 minus 50. Yeah, so that's another way to do things, or to just check your math. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to talk about before I cut off the video for the end of the first part of this is how shifting demand curves can change welfare. And so this shouldn't be that surprising, because we already know that when we shift a demand curve or a supply curve, that's going to change our equilibrium price and quantity, right? So in this slide, I have an example of just a market supply and demand curve on the left, and then on the right, I have a shift in demand. So we had our old equilibrium, I'll call it E0, and now our new equilibrium, 1. And what's happened is that you can probably tell that consumer surplus is lower, as well as producer surplus is lower. There are no numbers on these graphs, but if you really wanted to know the actual magnitude of the change in consumer surplus and producer surplus, what you would do is calculate consumer surplus beforehand, and then calculate consumer surplus after the shift in demand, and then compare those two values. And you can do that with producer surplus and total surplus as well. And so, of course, we could also have a shift in supply. And I'm going to pause. So yes, so we can also have a shift in supply, just like we can shift our demand curve. Again, on the left, I just have the same market as before, just price and quantity. And then on the right, I show that we are shifting our supply curve to the right, increasing our supply. And visually, it looks like our consumer surplus has increased and our producer surplus has increased. But of course, if you had actual specific numbers for these things, you could directly compare consumer surplus before and after the increase in supply. Okay, so I'm going to cut off the video here and continue on in a second recording just to break things up for you guys.